an important film, and one that's not easy to come across. You can't just watch it on YouTube. It's an important and respected film made in 1993 by three professors at the University of Memphis who all happen to be friends of mine. And in the history department, in the communication, the film department, this was something of a labour of love for them, because they wanted to make this film about what happened in their city in 1968, the Memphis sanitation workers' strike that brought Martin Luther King to Memphis, where he met his death. So this is a film about that strike, and I'm going to do a short introduction, so just a few minutes, to think about it in some wider context. And it's something of a balancing act, because what I'm not going to do is tell you everything that happens in the film. Although you know the ending, you don't know the ending, you don't know the story of the sanitation workers' strike in the way that we all know what happened to Martin Luther King in Memphis. So I'm also going to try to strike a balance between thinking about the importance of King in that moment, but thinking more about the importance of 1,300 African-American men who went on strike in 1968 and succeeded in getting the rights and demands that they needed and wanted and should have had all along. So, this film is narrated by Paul Winfield, and I'm telling you that in case you're sitting there thinking, whose voice is this? And some of you may have an image, I should have brought one, of Paul Winfield. But if you don't and you want to watch it, Paul Winfield played Martin Luther King in a 6-hour TV epic movie in 1978, so only 10 years after King died. So choosing Paul Winfield as the narrator is actually quite a brave thing to do, because that film was not popular. It was a kind of docudrama about King's life. You can imagine, with 6 hours, it went through in some detail. It was something of a talking heads about the different civil rights organisations, about the different arguments between the organisations, between men and women and men. And it finished with the death of Martin Luther King in Memphis. And for some people, that was just too raw 10 years after the fact. So by bringing the man who dramatised King into this film as a narrator, that's quite an interesting take on what they tried to do here. But the reason that we're watching it is this. Glenn Ligon, whose exhibition you've all been to, created this print in 1988, and it is oil and enamel on canvas, and he used the image of the sanitation workers' billboard strike slogan for his print. And by 1997 he realised that the print was deteriorating, and so in 2000 he sent it to Michael Duffy, the conservator, and he asked Michael Duffy to do what he called his condition report. And although that you can't see it that clearly here, all the way around the painting, and this is the one in the exhibition, is an indication of its deterioration. And while metaphors like blemish might seem quite weak, other metaphors like crack or fissure or stain are much more powerful. And what this really is for Ligon, I think, is a kind of health check on the racial health of the nation. It's a condition report. And when he came to talk to us here, just seems a long time ago now, I must say, but a month or so ago, when he came and was in this room talking to us, he talked about this print, and I wrote down what he said. He said, "Would it make sense to have a strike where black men carried a sign like that today? Well, no." In other words, he answered his own question. He was talking about the fact that this image had created a series of prints both in his mind and in an exhibition, and he wondered whether this image could be used today. It's interesting that it's a kind of dual provenance. It's both Michael Duffy's painting and his own, because this is very much about conserving, also measuring, checking back on the gains made during the civil rights movement and the extent to which those gains have been monitored, preserved, valued and checked. So this is where we started. This may also be what Ligon was thinking about. It's a quotation from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man that some people who go to the Encounter study sessions will be looking at this Thursday. A 1952 novel that some of you will have read, I know, that is a kind of disquisition, an artistic and aesthetic disquisition, again, on the racial health of the nation. And because Ralph Ellison is an influence on Ligon, this quotation, I am a man of substance of flesh and bone, fibre and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. The image that this novel pivots on is that of the huge visibility of the African-American man in American society in the 1950s and his invisibility in terms of those race and rights issues that we've been considering. You might have in your mind another image entirely, though. And out of the British tradition, here is, of course, Josiah Wedgwood's image from the 18th century. Am I not a man and a brother? No question mark there, and yet it is a question, isn't it? This was a medallion. He called it the Slave Medallion. It's mass-produced and it's used in the 18th century for anti-slavery sentiment, for the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave in Britain. It was mass-produced, commodified. He gave it away. In many ways, it was used on pamphlets, in newsletters, in abolitionist literature, but it became an adornment. So some women wore it as brooches, they wore it in their hair. So in many ways it served its purpose, but it also risked losing it, perhaps, at that level of commodification. If that's a question, even if it's a rhetorical one, the sanitation workers knew the answer to that question. And what they have here is an image. You won't see precisely this image in the film, but here you can see the slogan is borne aloft, but it's also written on the body. So these male workers, these men, were both themselves and also symbols of so much more. A kind of walking symbol, if you like, of the ideology that they wished to prise into the heads of those who could not see it. The slogan was a refutation of the plantation mentality. And they saw this plantation mentality as encapsulated in the Memphis officials who refuted the reasons for their strike. So in City Hall, in the council chambers, and as embodied in Mayor Henry Loeb. And you will see one striking example in the film today of that kind of plantation mentality that slaveholders, then southern planters, then bosses on plantations and overseers used when they infantilized African Americans and called African American men boy as an effort to contain their workforce and to contain their families. And even as late as the 1960s, some white publishers, certainly in Memphis, would refuse to use Mrs. or Mr. as the appellations for African American people in the news. And so if it was a Mr. or a Mrs., then the nomenclature meant that that was a white person. And if not, if that person was not given the dignity of that, that meant it was a black person who was being referred to in the news item. So this mentality is clearly one that these men were aware of. And two images I'm showing you here, which are from the Memphis City Library collection that I have permission for. This is an indication that even though Memphis was a city that did not see some of the awful, violent demonstrations like those in Selma, say, or in various parts of Mississippi, Memphis was not an easy city, and here you see people fighting segregation, and here, and this is a rare image and therefore one that I wanted to show you, here you see two slogans in a war, and the woman and the man, two ideologies at war. Somebody's peering. The last one at the end says NAACP is communist, the little one that you're peering at. She's saying elect white men with white hearts. And he's saying, before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. So quoting an old spiritual that becomes a freedom song. So this is the context of the plantation mentality that these strikers knew they were entering. And the slogan came part way through the strike. Nobody knows who thought it up. It's not something that we've been able to find out whose idea was it to use I am a man. The strikers used lots of slogans, but this one touched the imagination of the public. And it also touched the imagination of Martin Luther King. So other people had come to Memphis, Bayard Rustin. Other people had come to speak, but it was King who they got. And it was King that made a change in this strike. And in the moment that he went to Memphis, Martin Luther King was considered a very dangerous man. 1 year to the day before his assassination in Memphis, he spoke out in a speech called A Time to End Silence, a time to break silence, about the Vietnam War. And he called the US government the worst purveyor of violence in the world. In other words, if some people thought that King's appropriate subject was race and rights and only that, King's values were very much around what he called the real revolution that was about poverty and labour and war and other things. So what he spoke about was the disproportionate number of black men who were fighting in Vietnam, being asked to go 8,000 miles, he said, to give America and American soldiers rights that they did not have at home, whether in Georgia or Harlem or Mississippi. So in this film, you will see not only the I am a man strike slogan, but also others. In other words, it may be that this I am a man seems hopelessly gendered to you now. Glenn Ligon said we wouldn't perhaps use it, but there were other slogans like dignity and jobs and justice. And we shouldn't forget that these were all men, 1,300 men, and that the reason for the strike was that 2 of them had been killed in a garbage truck, crushed to death, and that their families were left with nothing because the men had no rights, no accident insurance, nothing. So the faulty equipment, the lack of attention paid to these workers was very important for them to challenge. And that image has swelled too. The image of In a Million Man March in 1995. Interesting to see, if you remember this march, as some of you I know sitting there will and others may not, it was October the 16th, 1995. It was led by Louis Farrakhan. Mrs. Rosa Parks supported the march. There was a lot of debate, wasn't there, about whether this was gendered, and that debate continues. Women for Justice now, who are the mothers of some of the young people who've been killed by police brutality, are creating a Million Moms march. So those images continue too. In 2009, a performance artist who called himself Dred Scott created this performance by walking the streets of Harlem, and he used the symbol in a different way to say that post the election of Obama, there was no such thing as a post-racial America. It was a utopian dream, and it always would be. So he couldn't change that image without us already understanding how incredibly tenacious that image has been. It was used after the assassination of Martin Luther King by strikers, by workers in lots of contexts. It was used by lots of historians as the images on their books. This is a first edition of one of mine with a co-editor. We changed the second edition so that it had a young girl protesting, very conscious of how this image felt. Here's Steve Estes, I Am a Man. These are the images that have been purveyed around this, but this is the one that I want to turn to. The young man in the back there, who looks as if he's going into the shop, is Larry Payne. Larry Payne was 16, and he's the only person who died during the sanitation workers' strike, and he's too often overlooked. The march that Martin Luther King went to lead turned into violence. You will see that. But Jack Thornell caught a very rare shot here of Larry Payne, who by the end of the day would have been killed by police. This should already be making us think about some of the connections through that march. One is that Larry Payne's death is, of course, forgotten in the context of Martin Luther King's own. Martin Luther King had called his mother Lizzie and sent his condolences, but he planned to visit her and died before he could fulfill that promise. Larry King may have been looting. That's the word that's used, isn't it? With those others who were rioting at the end of a march that had gone wrong. He may have been, but the police said he had a knife. And because they said he had a knife, they shot. And there was never any evidence found of a knife on Larry Payne. So 60 people were injured, and he was the fatality. And he is what brings me to think of the way in which the image has been used today. And this is something that you will know. I hardly need to run through this for you. But if you just listen to what Lizzie Payne said about her son in 1968. She said, "A lady ran and told me Harry had been shot by the police. I ran out to touch him. The police would not let me touch him. He said, 'Get back, nigger.' He put the barrel of the gun right into my stomach. I could feel it. I hate the policeman that killed him. They didn't even arrest him for killing Larry." So her suffering, and that case was reopened in 2007 with a lot of other cases that were reopened in each decade, speaks to some of these images that are now being created around I Am a Man, around I Am Trayvon Martin, I Am We Are. This picture made its way onto the Sun newspaper in the UK. Here we have, there's somebody up there who I know knows far more about this image than I do. But here we have Eric Garner's daughter, Erica Snipes, whose I Can't Breathe has turned global from the local. So where the sanitation workers' strike was a local strike that turned into a national movement, in the moment of social media, of course, things are very different. And her father's silence has been opened up by her voice. Here we have the protests for the murders of Tyrone West, and I think up in the top there, Freddie Gray as well, both dying in police custody in Baltimore, and an indication of how important women have been in organising these campaigns. And here we have the mother of Michael Brown being hugged by an unidentified supporter wearing that shirt that, of course, later becomes an important way of reusing, making real again the image of I Am a Man. So Black Lives Matter, I Can't Breathe, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, I Am Michael Brown. These are all ways in which the images of the protest have been used. And they are intriguing today. But one of the things that I want to say as you watch this film is look out for the unsung heroes. Look out for T.O. Jones. Look out for Maxine Smith. Think about the people, not Martin Luther King, who we know, but the people who are genuinely unsung. Look out as well for Reverend Lawson, who was there at the beginning of the civil rights movement, but who used this moment in ways that recall that early movement. So sit-ins, boycotts, freedom songs. Even in 1968, these were very important for a community that was as cohesive in its support of the strikers as was the Memphis African-American community. So look out for those people. And one idea I wanted to close on is tears. There are some tears in this movie, some tears about being tired, being fed up, and being relieved. And it's one of the rare movies, they're not Martin Luther King's tears, but it's one of the rare movies in which you see his eyes glisten and well up. And I think that's really important. It is to me anyway, because there are no pictures of Martin Luther King crying in all the images that we have of him. Not like there are of Obama, not like there are of Jesse Jackson. There aren't any images of King crying. And we've heard of him crying. In 1965, he went to an Alabama plantation and he cried because of poverty. He saw people without shoes. He saw people without money because they were using scrip in the commissary. So in that plantation mentality, they were being kept in indenture because they had no money to move away. And they were what Richard Wright called the long shocks of slavery in 1940. And in a sense, that's what this sanitation workers' strike was about. It was about the long shocks of slavery, and what we're going to watch on the screen is the way that some men who knew that the rights that they were owed were at least a century old, managed at last to claim those rights in 1968. So the film you're about to watch is about an hour, and I hope that you enjoy it. Thank you.